What's up everyone, Darcblade here, returning with my Mass Effect 3 multiplayer class guide. Today we are going to be taking a look at another DLC character recently released, the Krogan Adept Shaman. This class combines the durability of the Krogan with the biotic powers of an Adept, and this makes a very powerful class. Now like always, I spec my character for the harder difficulties in Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. I put maximum points into barrier, putting points into power recharge to reduce the actual power recharge penalty you get with barrier. I put points into power synergy over shield recharge because I want to increase the actual damage of my biotic abilities with the Krogan Shaman. And lastly, I put points into blast effect over barrier strength. This is because the actual bonus of blast effect is quite substantial, whilst the bonus you get from barrier strength is actually quite minimal. However, if you don't like to activate your barrier that often, then I would put points into barrier strength. Now I put maximum points into warp, putting points into pierce to debuff the enemies even more than warp originally does. I put points into expose to increase the amount of damage that targets take from powers and weaponry. Also, taking this over lasting damage is more beneficial as you'll be refreshing the warp debuff on enemies quite often. And lastly, I put points into detonate over damage. This is because I will be using warp as a setup for biotic explosions, which will be my main source of damage. I put maximum points as well into Shockwave, putting points into recharge speed. This is because lifting Shockwave isn't as beneficial for setting up biotic combos as warp is. I put points into detonate because, like I said, my main damage source will be coming from biotic explosions. Reach is a viable option, but only really if you're not comfortable with only having Shockwave go 16 meters. And lastly, I put points into force and damage, simply to make Shockwave that little bit more of a hard hitting ability. As for the passive abilities for the Krogan Adept Shaman, I put 5 points into Krogan Berserker, putting points into increasing my power damage as well as decreasing the weight of my weapons. Lastly, I put a few points into Rage, simply to increase my health and shields that little bit extra. Now, as for weaponry, I go with a nice pistol and or a light shotgun for the Krogan Adept. I personally found the Acolyte a really useful weapon for the Krogan Adept Shaman, simply because this removes shields and barriers so quickly, and an unshielded or unbarriered enemy is really easy to dispatch with biotic powers. Anyway, let's get into the heart of the episode and talk about the Krogan Shaman Adept's moves and abilities. Its first ability is Barrier. This move allows the Krogan Shaman to take a lot of damage. Whilst the Krogan Shaman has Barrier activated, it will reduce all forms of damage done against him. Unfortunately, as a penalty for having Barrier active, the Krogan Shaman will have his power recharge timer increased. This means that he can potentially use his powers quicker if he is not wearing the Barrier. However, you really want to consider wearing the barrier all the time, not only for the damage protection, but for the power synergy talent, which increases the actual damage of your biotic abilities. Lastly, barrier has a nasty surprise for any enemy who gets too close to the Krogan Shaman Adept. Basically, the barrier can be activated, sending out a blast wave, damaging enemies, and affecting unprotected enemies with the ability Pull. Pull can be followed up with Shockwave or Warp for a biotic explosion too. You just have to be cautious when activating your barrier. You have to remember to put it back on afterwards. Now the second move and ability in the Krogan Shaman Adept's arsenal is Warp. I've explained Warp in a great deal of other videos as it is a common biotic ability. Basically it is a damage dealing move that puts a nice damage over time effect on enemies as well as nicely debuffing them, so it has 3 purposes. All of these aspects of Warp can be augmented thanks to the Warp tree. I personally like to put points into making Warp a nice debuffing ability, able to increase the amount of damage that enemies take, as well as reducing their resistances to yours and your teammates' damage. When facing an opponent, always make sure you open up with Warp. This way, the enemy will be debuffed for when you start shooting the enemy with your weaponry or attacking with other abilities. Now, one of the great reasons why I love the ability Warp is that it can be used to set up biotic explosions. Once an enemy has been affected by Warp, hit them with a second biotic based ability to create a biotic explosion. The biotic explosion basically deals a ton of damage to the initial target and anyone else around them. The biotic explosion doesn't actually have to be activated by you, it can be activated by your teammates' biotic moves as well. Enemies who are affected by the biotic explosion will be staggered, giving you and your teammates a slight breather because it breaks the enemy's attack cycle. Lastly, remember that warp is a slow moving projectile. This means that it can arc over walls and obstacles to hit enemies who are taking cover behind small barriers. Use this to your advantage and aim slightly above enemies when trying to hit someone who's in cover. Now the third and final ability in the Krogan Shaman Adept's arsenal is Shockwave. This move is a powerful biotic move that sends a cascading wall of biotic energy towards opponents. Shockwave itself can do a lot of damage, but not only that, it can stagger or outright knock over opponents. This gives the Krogan Shaman Adept a little bit of crowd control, as long as he can keep using Shockwave to keep enemies in check. Now a downside to Shockwave is that it does have a short range, only 16 meters by default. This can be augmented in the Shockwave tree, but like I explained earlier in the video, I think it's more beneficial to put points into detonate. This is because the main aspect of Shockwave, in my opinion, is that it can be used to detonate biotic explosions. As we're talking about the Krogan Shaman Adept here, I mean biotic explosions set up by warp. Shockwave is an excellent move to activate biotic explosions. This is because the Shockwave can penetrate walls and obstacles. So even if an enemy is out of line of sight, you can still affect them with Shockwave. So as the Krogan Shaman Adept, what you really want to do is focus on affecting someone with warp and then follow that up with a Shockwave attack. This way, you'll be able to dish out a lot of damage solely using the Krogan Shaman Adept's biotic abilities. As for the passive abilities, these are always down to personal preference, I say. But for the Krogan Shaman Adept, I put 5 points into Krogan Berserker, putting points into increasing the force and power damage of my abilities, as well as reducing the actual weight of my weaponry. I put a few points into Rage to basically give my Krogan Shaman Adept a little bit more health and a little bit more shields. I don't have to worry too much about survivability, thanks to the fact that I'm using Barrier and that I have it on pretty much all the time. Now, the Krogan as a race I've talked about before. These are a strong and hardy race. They have a lot of health and a lot of shields. They pretty much have the most and highest health in the game. This is also another reason why I felt I didn't have to put that much points into Rage, simply because the Krogan Shaman Adept already has high health and high shields without putting a single point into the Rage tree. The Krogan as a race come with some very unique melee capabilities. I mean, the Krogan are renowned for their melee capabilities, so I'm not surprised they're good at it. Their standard melee is a straightforward headbutt that dishes out a fair amount of damage, but their heavy melee is a charge move that does a lot more damage. This move can actually knock opponents off their feet and stagger larger enemies. But on top of that, if a Krogan manages to get 3 melee kills in quite a short time frame, they go into a Krogan Rage mode. Basically, this mode sends the Krogan into a frenzy where their melee damage capabilities is increased significantly, but also they take less damage for 30 seconds. You'll know when your Krogan's gone into its frenzy as the screen will go very bright. It's actually not that convenient to go into your frenzy whilst you're out in a snowstorm though. You have to be careful with the Krogan heavy melee because there is a chance you will miss with this, and this could lead you into danger, so just be aware of it when you go to charge someone. Now, having high health, high shields and a great melee comes at a cost. The Krogan as a race have a very slow movement speed. They have a lack of maneuverability. They have no dodge move too. They're quite a big and bulky target, very sluggish to move about the battlefield. This can result in them taking damage, but as a result, this is why they've got the high health and high shields. Now the last point I want to talk about is the weaponry. You don't want to overburden yourself with too much weaponry. Like I said at the start of the video, go with a nice pistol and or a light shotgun. I went with the Aculite because like I said at the start of the video as well, they are really good at removing shields. If you like to rely on weapons and use heavier weaponry, then I would advise a different build, because the build I'm using here really does get the most out of the Krogan Shaman Adept's biotic abilities. Overall, the Krogan Shaman Adept is a great biotic character. It has a nice set of abilities, able to set up and activate its own biotic explosions thanks to the Warp Shockwave combo. It also has nice survivability potential as well, thanks to Barrier and the fact that the character is a Krogan. Anyway, I've been Darcblade, bringing you my Mass Effect 3 multiplayer class guide to the Krogan Shaman Adept. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.